Greetings, friends, and welcome to this week's edition of Torah View, Torah portion of Shlach. We're going to start this week with a pretty wow story from the Talmud. Here it goes. The sage Abaya once overheard a certain man say to a certain woman, "Let us rise up early and set out together on our way." This is not a husband and a wife. This is a man and a woman who are not married to each other. Abai overheard that, and he said to himself, "I will follow behind them to keep them from transgression, make sure everything is kosher." He followed behind them for a distance of 3 parsah, which is a considerable distance, in a meadow. When they reached a crossroads and took leave of one another, this man and woman, Abaya overheard them say cordially to each other, "Our paths lead far apart, so we cannot travel any further together, but the company would have been pleasant had we been able to do so." Upon seeing this, Abaya said to himself, "Were it my enemy who made the journey with that woman, he would have been unable to restrain himself from sin." His reference to his enemy, he's talking about his own enemy within, as in the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, would have not have been able to restrain himself. He went and leaned against a doorbolt and was despondent until a certain old man came and taught him. This old man was Elijah the prophet. That's a code name for him in the Talmud. And he said to him, "Whoever is greater than his fellow, his evil inclination is greater than his fellows as well." Abaya was disappointed in himself, knowing that he would not have been able to resist the temptation, and yet this seemingly ordinary fellow was able to do so. Why did he lean against the doorpost to reflect that? Why didn't he go inside, sit down, take a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, think about what transpired? One insight is offered by a leading scholar in Israel known as the Talmud Rebbe, and he said Abaya leaned on the outside of the doorpost because what he was saying to himself was, "I'm trying to get to a more inner space of holiness and spirituality, to be more internally connected, but I realize I'm on the outside. I'm still not there. I have so far to go." That's one way of looking at the story. But there's another way of looking at the story, perhaps from an opposite perspective. And that is that whilst it's difficult to transform ourselves on the inside, Abaya leaned on the outside as if to say, we can still control, however, what we allow to come inside of ourselves. We'll circle back to that soon, because that is going to be a major life lesson that emerges out of the Torah portion of this week, the portion of Shlach, the famous ill-fated mission of the spies dispatched by Moshe, the 12 spies, to do reconnaissance on the land of Israel. Now, friends, we know that every week we read at the end of the Torah reading, or portion of the week, the Haftorah, which conceptually correlates with the Torah portion. This week's Torah portion, this week's Haftorah, correlates in a very direct manner, as the Haftorah is the story of Joshua 40 years later, or 39 years after this episode with Moshe. Joshua is sending 2 spies to the land of Israel who came back with a favorable report and were successful in terms of their mission and the outcome as well. Now, the question is, how could Yehoshua even have attempted to send spies when he was one of the original 12 spies that was sent by Moshe? And he knew how dramatic the outcome of that was, and he knew how perilous that type of mission was. So how did he even have the audacity to send spies? And how was his dispatch of spies more successful than that of his teacher Moses? Of course, we know that the idea to send spies to do recon on the land was not Moshe's idea. It came from the people. But he felt that if he would have put the brakes on it, they would have felt like there's something to hide. So in the name of transparency, he said, I'm not initiating this, but if this is what you want to do, then go ahead. Got nothing to hide. In other words, imagine you come to a showroom to buy a car or to lease a car, and you ask the salesperson to go for a test drive, and he says, no, I don't think so. Well, you're immediately going to be suspicious that there's something about this car that he doesn't want you to know. So in the name of transparency, he's going to say, absolutely, go right ahead, take it for a test drive. That was sort of Moshe's attitude here in the way he responded to the request to send a mission to the land of Canaan. Of course, the outcome was disastrous, as 10 of the 12 spies came back and said, the land is just unconquerable. The cities are fortified, and there are giants there, and they said, we just can't do it. Only 2 of the spies, Yehoshua and Kalev, delivered an opposite conclusion to their mission. Now, we know historically that the night that they came back and delivered this negative report, instilling such despondency in the hearts of the people about the quote-unquote promised land that's not sounding very promising, to say the least, was the night of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av then was an ordinary day, but the people cried all night, and God said, tonight you cry, but you cry tears of vain, but in the future this day will be a day of great sadness for the Jewish people. And this very day, Tisha B'Av, years later, became the day when the first temple was destroyed, the second temple was destroyed, the onset of the Spanish Inquisition, the beginning of World War I, the expulsion of Jews from England. Many, many calamities befell the Jewish people on this day of Tisha B'Av. And for the people of that generation, it was disastrous. It was a Holocaust for them, because anyone who had reached the age of 20 when this occurred died over the course of the next 40 years, when it was decreed that they would spend the next 40 years in the desert, effectively wiping out an entire generation of the Jews who were mature at that time, which means people who had reached the age of 20. And yet, 39 years later, Yehoshua himself, who was one of the original spies, is now sending 2 spies of his own, when he knows that nothing changed on the ground in Israel. I mean, the topography didn't change, the fortified cities didn't change. I mean, nothing changed. So what gave him the confidence to think that his mission, his dispatch, would be successful when Moshe's had so dismally failed, and no one had a better front row seat to that than Yehoshua himself? Well, there's a few ways of looking at this, but there are some key words in the way the spies presented what they said to the people in terms of their negative report on the land. And one of the things was the way they described the land. They said that the land is more powerful than the Hebrew word mimenu, which means him, as if to say it's more powerful than God. The people who are there are more powerful than God. Now, how could they purport to say such a thing? The answer is this. One of the key fear factors was that they saw these giants. Now, there's a history to these giants. These giants were the offspring of angels that came down from heaven prior to the flood. Angels who said to God, look, we can see you've got your finger on the trigger. You're about to wipe out humanity. Give us a chance to go and save them. God said, no, I don't think it's a good idea. They said, well, we don't have an evil inclination. We're good. We're good to go. God said, all right, you want to try, go. They came down, instantly got corrupted, cavorted with women, and produced these giants. And these giants that were the offspring of these angels survived the flood. Now, the flood was supposed to have wiped out all of existence and all living things, and yet they survived. And that's why the spies said they're more powerful than God himself, because God said, I'm going to destroy everything with the flood, and they survived. So that was one of their key fears and how they pitched it to the people. And that's a key point here, BC, because there's a difference between the type of people that Moshe chose as to go on this recon mission versus Yehoshua, and that will begin to answer the question of how Yehoshua even conceived of the idea of doing so. Moshe chose very sophisticated people, wise people, understanding people, and people that he thought would do a good job at PR, selling Israel, selling Canaan to the people. Well, because they were so sophisticated, they came back with their own ideas as to what the reality on the ground was and what the chances were for the Jewish people to be able to conquer the land. In other words, they deviated from the mission. Their mission was not to determine whether Israel was conquerable, just how. But because they were so sophisticated and free-thinking, they went beyond what their mission was and concluded that it was not conquerable. Contrast that, the people that Yeshua sent were more simple people. They were just recon professionals. In fact, they're anonymous. We don't even know who they are. They're not named. And the point being, they simply went to execute the mission that they were sent on, which was, what is the best way to conquer the land? Case closed. Don't mix in your own conclusions. This is about the best way to conquer the land of Israel. Because they remained loyal to the marching orders, to the mission for which they were dispatched, they came back with a positive report, how it's conquerable. The people there are still trembling from us. They heard about how people are still talking about the splitting of the sea, the plagues, which only happened 40 years later. They were trembling in their knees, shaking in their knees when they heard that the Jewish people were about to enter the land of Israel. So this is one significant difference between the caliber of people that Moshe chose versus Yeshua. Yeshua chose more simple people. Simple in the positive sense, more wholesome, and therefore more loyal to the mission. So that's one key element here. And the other is this, and this brings us to the opening story of the sage Abaya and him standing at the threshold of the house in his confrontation with his own vulnerability, with his own temptation and inner demons, if you will. And this is a really beautiful psychological, spiritual understanding of the story of the spies and the difference between the spies sent by Moshe and those of Yeshua. But let me just sort of take a detour here for a moment and bring up the story of a very famous professor of mathematics named John Nash, who was the subject of a movie released in 2000 called A Beautiful Mind. So the story, of course, is that he was an extraordinary mathematician, but had sometimes started to develop psychotic visions of communists and red ties and who were after him, and he started sending letters to the government, and he developed a severe case of schizophrenia and mental health issues, and spent a number of years in mental hospitals and institutions. Well, finally, he came out and ready to start living his life again, and in 1994, he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics. And he comes to the ceremony where he receives the prize, and he's on top of the world. And if you recall the scene, if you've seen the movie, it comes out of that ceremony, and then all of a sudden, after all these years, these voices, these hallucinations start to enter his headspace. And his wife looks at him, and she can see, she knows that look. So, oh my God, she knows exactly what's happening inside of his mind. And he stops, and he looks at her, and he says, it's nothing, it's okay. And they walk off together. This was the key moment in his life when he was able to regain control of his own mind. He didn't allow those voices to infiltrate his inner headspace. And this is the key. You see, Moshe's sent spies on a mission that was going to last that lasted in fact for 40 days. And he sent them to spy on the entire length and breadth of the land. Whereas Yehoshua sent his spies only to Jericho, to Jericho. See, Jericho was called the gate, the portal of Israel. And Yeshua understood that to conquer the land, we don't have to conquer the whole land at once. All we have to do is conquer Jericho. All we have to do is control the entry point to the land, to control the entry point to Jericho, and eventually the rest will fall into place. So here's the thing. Moshe was after complete and total conquest of the land of Israel. What that means on a personal, psychological, spiritual level is what Moshe sought was to be able to engender and empower complete and total internal transformation so that none of us should have to struggle with any type of inner demons that might plague us, unsavory desires and lusts and so on. That we should be able to be free to serve God without being plagued by any inner turmoil. Yeshua understood that is beyond the pale for most of us now. You see, Moshe was ahead of his game. Moshe was already looking into the Messianic era, when we'll get to that point of transformation. But Yeshua understood that now our focus simply has to be on the Jericho, which is on the gate to our mind. And what that means is, what Yeshua understood was this: we cannot control the initial thoughts that rise up and percolate in our minds, but we can control as to whether we allow them into our inner headspace. Let's put it this way. We cannot control the first thought, which is what we may notice unintentionally, or the subconscious ideas that percolate. But we can control the second thought, which is whether we continue to go with that thinking, whether we allow it into the gate, whether we open the gate to allow those thoughts to infiltrate into our inner headspace and continue to contemplate them and marinate on them. That we can control. So Yeshua understood all we need to go after is Jericho. And if we can control Jericho, then we can continue to grow internally and work on inner transformation. But it's going to be a lifelong struggle. It's going to be a lifelong struggle. Because unless we've reached the level of tzaddik, of saintliness and saintlyhood, we will always have to contend with the Yetzer Hara, with the evil inclination. And God doesn't expect us to rid ourselves of that. But what we can do, however, is we can control our conscious secondary thoughts. We can control what we say, and we can control what we do. And that is why, to go back to the original story we opened up with, Abaye leaned on the doorway, because what he was symbolically suggesting was, maybe I can't control what's inside, but I can control the doorway to my mind. I can control what I choose to allow in. And that is the story of why Yeshua's spies were successful, because they didn't go for the whole enchilada. They didn't go for the whole complete and total transformation. They just went for the portal. So it's sort of like something pops up on your screen, on your computer screen. That's like a thought popping up on your mind. And it gives you the option to upload or download. Well, you have to choose to click on the mouse to download. That choice is yours. So in our mind, we have ideas that come up, but we control the mouse as to whether we download those ideas into our headspace and give them further life. So it's a real powerful takeaway that I think we can all learn from and integrate, and be realistic about what is really expected from us. God doesn't expect us to be saints. He just looks for us to be a work in motion, working on ourselves and realizing and understanding that we do hold the key to that gateway in our mind. Let us all pray for the strength to be able to always control that click on the inner mouse in our minds, and be able to always pursue thinking that is positive, that's taking us to a better place, that leads us to be better communicators as spouses and as parents and as co-workers and as friends and activists, because thoughts breed words and words breed action. And if we nip it right there at the portal, at that entry point, stay positive, the world will be a much more positive place. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel, Storm the World TV on YouTube. Wishing you Shabbat Shalom, and thanks for joining.